You can learn everything about a neighborhood by watching how it treats the smallest members of the family. I didn't fully understand that truth until the morning our HOA tried to decide which families belonged and which ones didn't. It was just after 7 on a cool Saturday when I stepped onto my front porch with a steaming mug of black coffee. The air carried the familiar scent of freshly cut grass, and sprinklers clicked rhythmically across neatly trimmed lawns. Somewhere down the street, I heard the cheerful jingle of a dog collar followed by the laughter of a little girl calling her golden retriever back onto the sidewalk. It sounded like every other peaceful morning in Willow Creek Estates. At least, it did for another few seconds. My phone vibrated in my pocket with the sharp tone reserved for HOA announcements. I glanced at the screen, expecting another reminder about landscaping or parking regulations. Instead, the subject line stopped me cold. Proposed Community Pet Restriction Policy. I frowned as I opened the email. The words became heavier with every sentence I read. The board would be voting on a proposal to prohibit nearly all household pets within the neighborhood over the coming months. Existing owners would face strict new conditions, while future residents would effectively lose the right to bring dogs or cats into Willow Creek. The explanation was brief. Increasing complaints, noise concerns, property maintenance, community standards, no supporting numbers, no resident survey, no mention of alternative solutions. Just a proposal that could completely change the character of our neighborhood. I lowered my phone and looked across the street. Mrs. Harper was slowly walking her elderly beagle, the same gentle dog that greeted every passing child with a lazy wag of its tail. A few houses farther down, a young boy knelt on the driveway tying a blue bandana around the neck of an energetic border collie before they headed toward the park together. Across another lawn, a couple loaded pet carriers into the back of an SUV, smiling as two curious cats watched from inside the windows. None of them knew what had just arrived in my inbox. They simply continued living their Saturday morning, completely unaware that someone had already begun deciding whether families like theirs still belonged here. My stomach tightened. I wasn't even thinking about my own Labrador, Cooper, who was quietly lying beside the porch steps, his tail thumping softly against the wooden boards as he watched squirrels race along the fence. I was thinking about every family whose daily routine included four paws waiting faithfully at the front door. To them, these weren't possessions. They were companions, protectors, therapy animals, childhood friends, and members of the family. As more neighbors stepped outside, I noticed phones beginning to appear in people's hands. Expressions changed almost instantly. Confusion, disbelief, concern. Small conversations started forming at the ends of driveways. A woman shook her head while reading the email aloud to her husband. Someone across the street pointed toward the clubhouse in visible frustration. Another neighbor simply stared at the screen without saying a word. For the first time since I'd moved into Willow Creek, the morning sounds felt different. The barking dogs hadn't changed. The birds were still singing from the oak trees lining the sidewalks. Children still laughed on their bicycles. Yet beneath those familiar sounds, I could almost hear something else settling over the neighborhood. Uncertainty. What Patricia Collins didn't realize when that email went out was that this wasn't going to become a fight about pets. It was about whether a community should be built on fear or on the families who called it home. Before anyone raised their voice, before the first HOA meeting was scheduled, and before a single vote was cast, the story had already begun. So before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If your neighborhood suddenly tried to tell you that your family wasn't welcome anymore, what would you do? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured families packing up years of memories because someone had decided that a barking dog was a bigger problem than listening to the people who actually lived here. By sunrise, Cooper was already sitting beside the front door with his leash in his mouth, staring at me with the patient expression only a Labrador could master. Our usual morning walk felt different. Neighbors who normally smiled and waved now gathered in small circles, phones still in their hands, replaying the same email over and over as if the words might somehow change. Some were angry. Others looked genuinely frightened. Nobody seemed to understand where the proposal had come from. As Cooper sniffed the edge of the sidewalk, I realized I had two choices. I could spend the next week complaining with everyone else, or I could find out what had actually happened. I chose the second. After breakfast, I drove to the Willow Creek Clubhouse. The parking lot was almost empty except for the landscaping truck parked near the maintenance shed. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and brewed coffee. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating framed photographs from neighborhood events stretching back nearly 15 years. It was hard to believe that the same community celebrating family picnics and holiday pet parades was now considering banning the very animals featured in many of those pictures. I signed in and requested access to the HOA records available to homeowners. The receptionist smiled politely and pointed me toward a quiet reading room stacked with binders, meeting minutes, annual budgets, and policy revisions. I spent hours turning page after page. Board meeting summaries, complaint logs, landscaping contracts, insurance reports, previous rule amendments. The deeper I looked, the stranger everything became. According to the complaint records, pet-related issues represented only a small portion of overall homeowner concerns. Most involved owners forgetting to clean up after their dogs or occasional noise complaints that had already been resolved. There was nothing suggesting a widespread crisis. I kept reading. The board had revised parking regulations twice within 5 years. Pool safety rules had been updated 3 separate times. Landscaping standards had been adjusted almost annually. Every major policy change included resident surveys, committee recommendations, or multiple rounds of public discussion. Everyone except this. There was no community survey, no advisory committee, no independent review, no neighborhood feedback. Just a proposal placed directly onto the upcoming meeting agenda. That missing piece bothered me more than anything else. Responsible decisions require evidence. Good communities require conversations. This proposal seemed to have skipped both. I copied several publicly available documents and carefully highlighted timelines, complaint statistics, and previous amendment procedures. As I organized the pages into a folder, one sentence from the governing documents kept echoing in my mind. The purpose of the association was to preserve both property values and the quality of community life. Those words mattered because they reminded me that neighborhoods aren't built only with sidewalks and fences. They're built with trust. When I finally stepped back outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the clubhouse windows. Across the street, a young family was tossing a tennis ball for their cheerful mixed-breed dog, while an elderly couple laughed from a nearby bench. It struck me that none of the documents inside could fully capture moments like that. Numbers could explain complaints, but they couldn't measure companionship. Policies could regulate behavior, but they couldn't define what made a neighborhood feel like home. Standing there with the folder tucked under my arm, I realized this story wasn't going to be one with emotion alone. It also wouldn't be one with statistics alone. Somehow, the truth would need both. The folder on my passenger seat felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't because of the papers inside. It was because I knew documents alone wouldn't change anyone's mind. People rarely remember statistics. They remember stories. As I drove slowly through Willow Creek that afternoon, I rolled the windows down and let the warm breeze carry the familiar sounds of the neighborhood inside my truck. A basketball bounced somewhere behind a row of maple trees. Wind chimes rang softly from a nearby porch. Cooper rested his head near the open window, his ears lifting every time another dog barked in. The distance. For the first time since receiving the HOA email, I wasn't looking at houses. I was looking at families. My first stop was the Harper's home. Mrs. Harper welcomed me onto her porch while her elderly beagle stretched comfortably across the welcome mat, barely opening one eye as we talked. She smiled sadly when I mentioned the proposal. "He's 13, she said, gently scratching behind the dog's ears. "He sleeps more than he walks now." I can't imagine someone looking at him and seeing a problem instead of a companion. I listened far more than I spoke. That became my plan for the rest of the day. At another house, a young couple introduced me to the energetic rescue dog they had adopted after moving into the neighborhood. Across the street, a retired schoolteacher showed me framed photographs of every family Christmas with the same orange tabby cat curled beside the fireplace. A father quietly explained how his daughter struggled with anxiety until their gentle Labrador became part of their daily routine. Every conversation was different, yet they all shared something in common. Nobody asked for special treatment. Nobody argued that irresponsible owners shouldn't be held accountable. Every single person simply wanted fair rules instead of a blanket ban. To make sure I wasn't hearing only one side, I also knocked on doors belonging to residents who didn't own pets. Some admitted they disliked barking or worried about owners who ignored cleanup responsibilities. Others confessed they had no problem with animals at all, but wished existing rules were enforced more consistently. One elderly gentleman surprised me by saying, "The issue isn't dogs. The issue is people who don't follow the rules. Banning every pet because of a few irresponsible owners doesn't solve the real problem." I wrote that sentence down immediately. By early evening, my notebook was filling with names, observations, and suggestions. Instead of complaints, I found ideas. Mandatory registration, stronger leash enforcement, better waste stations, clearer penalties for repeated violations, community education for new pet owners. The more I listened, the clearer the picture became. Willow Creek wasn't divided into pet owners versus non-pet owners. It was divided between people who wanted thoughtful solutions and a proposal that offered only the simplest answer. As the sun dipped lower, I walked Cooper through the neighborhood park. Children laughed as they tossed tennis balls across the grass, while parents chatted beneath the shade of towering oak trees. I noticed Patricia Collins standing near the clubhouse entrance, speaking quietly with another board member. She glanced toward the park for only a moment before continuing her conversation. I wondered if she had spent the day listening to the same voices I had. Somehow, I doubted it. I looked around one more time at the families scattered across the green space. None of them knew I had spent the entire day collecting their stories. But I knew something they didn't. The upcoming meeting was no longer going to be about whether pets belonged in Willow Creek. It was about whether every voice in this neighborhood deserved to be heard before someone rewrote the meaning of home. By Monday morning, my dining room looked less like part of a home and more like a small research office. The table had disappeared beneath neatly stacked HOA documents, highlighted complaint logs, handwritten interview notes, printed neighborhood maps, and a growing collection of sticky notes that connected one idea to another. Cooper lay quietly beneath the table, occasionally lifting his head whenever I shifted another stack of papers. The rhythmic tapping of my keyboard mixed with the soft hum of the ceiling fan as sunlight drifted across the room. Every document I reviewed confirmed the same conclusion. The proposal wasn't supported by enough evidence to justify changing the lives of hundreds of residents. More importantly, nearly every person I had spoken with believed there was a better solution than banning pets altogether. That realization changed my entire approach. I stopped thinking about how to defeat the proposal. Instead, I focused on building something stronger to replace it. Anyone can criticize a problem. Real leadership offers a better answer. I opened a blank document on my laptop and typed a new heading, Community Pet Responsibility Program. The title sounded simple, but the ideas underneath represented dozens of conversations collected from every corner of Willow Creek. Mandatory pet registration with the HOA. Updated vaccination records. Clearly defined leash requirements in common areas. Additional waste stations throughout neighborhood walking paths. Graduated penalties for repeated violations instead of immediate punishment for everyone. Educational materials for new residents moving into the community with pets. A volunteer committee to review complaints before recommending policy changes. One by one, the outline began taking shape. Each suggestion solved an actual concern raised by residents without taking away responsible families' ability to keep the animals they loved. The more I refined the proposal, the more confident I became that this wasn't simply an emotional argument. It was a practical one. Later that afternoon, I drove through 3 neighboring communities with active HOAs. I walked their parks, read posted regulations, and photographed public signs describing pet policies. None of them prohibited pets outright. Instead, every community emphasized owner responsibility, enforcement, and education. Back at home, I compared their guidelines with Willow Creek's governing documents. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Successful neighborhoods weren't banning pets. They were managing expectations. By evening, my folder had grown considerably thicker. Charts summarized complaint categories over the previous several years. Graphs illustrated how few documented incidents actually involved animals compared with parking disputes or landscaping violations. Survey notes highlighted recurring themes from both pet owners and non-pet owners alike. Every page pointed toward the same conclusion. Accountability worked better than prohibition. Just before dinner, my phone buzzed with a neighborhood group message. Someone had posted another heated argument about the proposed ban. Replies poured in almost instantly. Emotions were escalating. Accusations replaced conversations. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone face down. I had no interest in winning an argument online. The board meeting would decide the future of this proposal, not a comment thread. If I wanted people to listen, I needed facts that were impossible to dismiss and a solution that respected everyone sitting in that meeting room. As the evening settled over Willow Creek, I carried my folder onto the back patio. Cooper curled beside my chair while crickets filled the quiet air with their steady chorus. Across neighboring fences, I could hear families finishing dinner, children laughing, and the occasional bark echoing into the fading light. Those ordinary sounds reminded me exactly what was at stake. This wasn't about choosing pets over neighbors. It was about proving that a strong community doesn't solve difficult questions by dividing families. It solves them by giving every voice a place at the table before any decision is made. The parking lot outside the Willow Creek Clubhouse had never been so full. Pickup trucks, family SUVs, compact sedans, and even a few bicycles lined the curbs as neighbors streamed toward the entrance carrying folders, notebooks, and cups of coffee. The meeting wasn't scheduled to begin for another 20 minutes, yet the lobby was already buzzing with quiet conversations. Normally, HOA meetings attracted only a handful of residents. Tonight, nearly every chair inside the community room had been claimed before the board members even arrived. I tightened my grip on the blue folder tucked beneath my arm and took a slow breath. Cooper was safely at home, but somehow I could still imagine the steady rhythm of his tail tapping against the floor whenever I walked through the front door. That simple thought reminded me why I was here. Not to win an argument. To protect the trust that made neighbors feel like neighbors. Inside the meeting room, fluorescent lights reflected off polished wooden tables, while a projector illuminated the agenda on the front wall. Item 4 read exactly as expected: Proposed Community Pet Restriction Policy. Patricia Collins sat confidently at the center of the board table, arranging neatly organized documents before glancing around the room. She appeared calm and prepared, greeting residents with the same professional smile she brought to every meeting. Nothing about her expression suggested hostility. If anything, she genuinely believed the proposal would improve the community. That realization made this moment even more important. Good intentions could still produce bad decisions if they weren't supported by good information. After routine business concluded, Patricia adjusted the microphone. The room became almost perfectly silent. She explained that several residents had expressed concerns regarding barking, pet waste, leash violations, and occasional property damage. She emphasized the board's responsibility to preserve neighborhood standards and maintain a peaceful environment. Her tone remained measured, respectful, and composed throughout the presentation. There were no dramatic accusations, only a belief that stricter action might prevent future conflicts. When she finished, she invited homeowner comments. For a brief second, nobody moved. Then I stood. Every conversation I had collected over the previous week suddenly seemed to settle quietly onto my shoulders. I walked toward the podium carrying only my folder and a single sheet summarizing the proposal I had spent days refining. The microphone amplified the sound of my footsteps across the room before I finally looked up at the audience. I began with something no chart could show. I spoke about neighbors greeting one another during evening walks, children growing up alongside loyal companions, and elderly residents whose pets eased loneliness after losing loved ones. Then I shifted to the evidence. Complaint statistics, HOA procedures, survey results gathered from dozens of households, comparable policies from nearby communities. Every figure appeared on the projection screen behind me as I explained how responsible ownership could address legitimate concerns without removing pets from responsible families. I wasn't asking the board to ignore problems. I was asking them to solve the right problem. Finally, I presented the Community Pet Responsibility Program. Registration, education, enforcement, clear accountability, practical solutions instead of permanent prohibition. As I stepped away from the podium, I noticed something unexpected. The room remained completely quiet, not because people disagreed, but because they were thinking. Patricia lowered her eyes to the documents in front of her before slowly looking back toward me. For the first time that evening, the discussion no longer felt like two sides preparing for a fight. It felt like a community standing at the edge of an important decision, trying to determine whether fear or fairness would shape its future. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the first chair scraped gently across the floor. An elderly man in the third row stood up, straightened his jacket, and slowly walked toward the microphone. I recognized him immediately. It was the same neighbor who had told me a few days earlier that irresponsible owners, not pets, were the real issue. He rested both hands on the podium and looked around the room before speaking in a calm, steady voice. "I've lived here for 12 years, he began. I've had noisy neighbors, parking problems, broken sprinklers, and overgrown lawns. Every one of those situations was handled by addressing the people responsible. We never punished the entire neighborhood because of a handful of mistakes. I don't think we should start now." Several heads nodded quietly around the room. When he returned to his seat, a young mother approached the microphone carrying a folded piece of paper she never once looked at. Instead, she spoke from memory. She described how her rescue dog had helped her son regain confidence after months of struggling with anxiety. She wasn't asking the board for sympathy. She simply wanted them to understand that behind every pet registration number was a real family with a story no spreadsheet could fully explain. Another resident followed, this time a retired nurse who admitted she didn't own any pets herself. "I enjoy peaceful evenings just as much as anyone," she said with a gentle smile. "But I also believe communities become stronger when we solve problems precisely instead of broadly. If someone breaks the rules, enforce the rules. Don't remove something that brings joy to responsible families." Her words were followed by quiet applause that quickly spread through the room before fading again into respectful silence. One after another, neighbors continued speaking. Some owned dogs, some owned cats, some had no animals at all. Yet a pattern emerged that even the board could not ignore. Nobody denied that occasional problems existed. Nobody argued against accountability. What people rejected was the assumption that the only solution was prohibition. I glanced toward Patricia Collins. Throughout the testimony, she remained composed, taking careful notes beside the printed proposal. Every so often she paused, looked toward the speaker, then returned to writing. Whatever she was thinking remained impossible to read, but she was listening, really listening. That alone felt like progress. As the final homeowner finished speaking, the room settled into another thoughtful silence. It no longer carried tension. It carried reflection. The discussion had changed. Earlier that evening, the proposal had centered on pets. Now it centered on fairness, responsibility, and whether every resident deserved to participate before major decisions reshaped community life. Patricia adjusted her microphone and thanked everyone for maintaining respect throughout the meeting. She acknowledged the effort many residents had made to gather information and present constructive alternatives. Then she looked briefly in my direction before addressing the room once more. "It's clear this community cares deeply about both neighborhood standards and one another," she said. "Our responsibility is to consider all of that carefully before moving forward." Those words weren't a decision. They weren't a victory either. But they were different from the certainty that had filled the original proposal. I realized then that changing minds rarely happens through one dramatic speech. It happens when enough honest voices reveal a larger truth together. Looking around the room at neighbors who only days earlier had been strangers connected by little more than shared sidewalks, I understood something I hadn't expected. We weren't simply defending the right to keep pets. We were rediscovering what it meant to be a community willing to listen before deciding the future of every family who called Willow Creek home. The board recessed for several minutes before returning to the front table. During that short break, nobody left the room. Conversation stayed low and respectful, as though everyone instinctively understood that the next few moments would shape far more than a single HOA policy. I remained near the back wall with my folder resting against my leg. I wasn't rehearsing another speech because there was nothing left to say. The evidence had been presented. The stories had been shared. Now the decision belonged to the board. Patricia Collins returned to her seat carrying a fresh set of notes. Her expression remained composed, but there was something different in the way she looked around the room. Earlier in the evening, she had addressed homeowners from behind the proposal. Now she seemed to be looking directly at the people whose lives would be affected by it. She thanked everyone again for maintaining a respectful discussion before explaining that the board had carefully considered both the original recommendation and the alternative plan presented by residents. The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the projector above our heads. Patricia paused briefly before continuing. After reviewing the available information and listening to community feedback, she said, the board will not move forward with the proposed neighborhood-wide pet prohibition. A collective breath seemed to leave the room all at once. Nobody erupted into celebration. There were no cheers or raised fists. Instead, relieved smiles quietly appeared across familiar faces as neighbors exchanged grateful glances. The tension that had settled over Willow Creek since the first email finally began to dissolve. Patricia wasn't finished. She explained that the board would instead begin work on a revised community pet responsibility program based on many of the recommendations submitted by residents. Registration requirements would be updated. Existing leash and cleanup rules would be clarified. Repeat violations would carry stronger consequences for irresponsible owners, while responsible families would continue enjoying the companionship of their pets. Education materials would be created for new homeowners, and a volunteer advisory committee would help review future policy recommendations before they reach the board. As she outlined each point, I recognized ideas collected from conversations on front porches, neighborhood sidewalks, and kitchen tables throughout the week. None of them belonged to me alone. They belonged to the community. When Patricia concluded, she looked toward me for a brief moment before addressing everyone once again. This process reminded us that good governance depends on listening as much as leading, she said. Thank you for bringing thoughtful solutions instead of simply opposing change. Her words surprised me because they acknowledged something larger than the outcome itself. The meeting had transformed from a debate into collaboration. Several board members nodded in agreement before unanimously approving the revised direction. Residents began gathering their belongings, but few rushed toward the exits. Instead, neighbors lingered in small groups, introducing themselves to people they had never spoken with despite living only a few houses apart. I watched a retired couple chatting with young parents while another resident exchanged contact information with someone interested in helping develop the new committee. It struck me that the strongest result of the evening wasn't the vote recorded in the meeting minutes. It was the relationships quietly forming across the room. As I stepped outside, the cool night air felt noticeably lighter than when I had walked in. The clubhouse lights reflected softly across parked cars while distant porch lights illuminated the familiar streets of Willow Creek. My phone buzzed with a simple text from a neighbor. Thank you for listening before speaking. I read the message twice before slipping the phone back into my pocket. Walking toward my truck, I realized the neighborhood hadn't chosen pets over rules. It had chosen responsibility over fear, dialogue over assumptions, and families over division. That was the decision that would matter. Long after the meeting minutes were forgotten. The weeks after the vote were surprisingly quiet, but they weren't idle. Instead of filling neighborhood message boards with arguments, Willow Creek became busy with something far more productive. Conversations replaced complaints. Ideas replaced assumptions. For the first time since I had moved into the neighborhood, it felt as though people were working toward the same goal instead of protecting opposite sides. A few days after the meeting, I received an email from the HOA inviting volunteers to participate in the new Community Pet Responsibility Committee. My name appeared alongside several others, including pet owners, residents without pets, and one unexpected name that made me pause for a moment, Patricia Collins. We met on a Tuesday evening inside the same clubhouse where the proposal had nearly divided the neighborhood. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different. The chairs were arranged in a circle instead of facing a board table. Coffee and bottled water sat on a small counter near the entrance. People introduced themselves instead of waiting for permission to speak. Patricia opened the meeting with a simple sentence. Let's build something that works for everyone. It wasn't a dramatic apology, nor did it need to be. It was an acknowledgement that collaboration had become more valuable than defending old positions. Over the following weeks, we reviewed every recommendation collected from residents. We refined registration procedures to make them easier for homeowners while ensuring emergency contact information remained current. We updated community guidelines using clearer language so expectations would be easy to understand instead of open to interpretation. Additional waste stations were installed along the neighborhood walking paths after volunteers identified the locations residents used most frequently. Educational welcome packets for new homeowners included practical information about responsible pet ownership alongside every other HOA guideline. Even small improvements began making a noticeable difference. During one Saturday volunteer event, families gathered to clean common areas, repaint park benches, and install new informational signs near walking trails. Children laughed as they handed out bottled water, while neighbors who had barely known each other's names only a month earlier worked side by side planting flowers around the entrance to the neighborhood park. Cooper happily greeted nearly everyone who passed by, earning smiles from residents who had once worried that pets themselves were the problem. I noticed Patricia speaking with several homeowners throughout the morning, asking questions, listening carefully, and writing down suggestions in the same notebook she carried during board meetings. She no longer seemed separated from the community by the title of HOA president. She simply looked like another neighbor trying to help improve the place she called home. One afternoon, as we finished reviewing the final draft of the updated policy, Patricia quietly stopped beside my chair before everyone left the clubhouse. "You challenged the proposal without attacking the people behind it," she said. "I appreciate that more than you probably realize." I smiled and closed my folder. "I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong," I replied. "I just wanted us to make the best decision together." She nodded thoughtfully before walking toward the parking lot. Watching her leave, I realized that respect had accomplished something anger never could have. It had created room for people to change their minds without losing their dignity. As summer settled over Willow Creek, evening walks became busy once again. Families greeted one another from shaded front porches, while children rode bicycles beneath towering oak trees. Dogs walked calmly beside their owners, neighbors waved as they passed, and the familiar sounds of everyday life filled the streets exactly as they had before the proposal ever appeared. The difference wasn't in the neighborhood itself. The difference was that everyone now understood something they hadn't fully appreciated before. Strong communities aren't built by writing stricter rules. They're built by earning one another's trust, one thoughtful conversation at a time. 6 months later, I found myself standing in the same neighborhood park, where so much of this story had quietly come full circle. The evening sun stretched long golden shadows across the walking paths as children chased one another through the grass. Bicycles rolled peacefully along the sidewalks, and the familiar sound of happy dogs greeting their owners blended naturally with laughter carried by a warm summer breeze. If someone had visited Willow Creek for the first time that afternoon, they never would have guessed our community had once come within a single vote of changing forever. Cooper trotted comfortably beside me, stopping every few yards to investigate another patch of grass or accept a friendly pat from a passing neighbor. What struck me most wasn't how many people still had pets. It was how much more connected everyone seemed. The additional waste stations were being used. The updated walking trail signs had become part of the landscape. New homeowners received clear information before moving in, preventing misunderstandings before they ever became complaints. Responsible ownership had quietly become the expectation instead of the exception. Even the neighborhood message board looked different. Arguments had largely been replaced by reminders about volunteer events, lost and found notices, community picnics, and photos celebrating local gatherings. Problems still happen from time to time because every neighborhood has disagreements. But people now seemed far more willing to solve them by talking to one another before demanding new restrictions. That simple change made all the difference. As Cooper and I approached the park entrance, I noticed Patricia Collins standing near a newly planted flower bed speaking with 2 families who had recently moved into Willow Creek. She smiled as she pointed toward the welcome information posted beside the walking trail before the families thanked her and continued into the park. When she noticed me, she walked over carrying the same notebook I remembered from every committee meeting, though it looked far less full these days. "Looks like Cooper still thinks he owns the neighborhood," she said with a laugh as he happily wagged his tail at her. "Only the parts with squirrels," I answered, smiling back. We stood together for a moment watching children throw tennis balls while several dogs raced joyfully across the open grass. Neither of us felt the need to revisit the proposal that had started everything. The neighborhood itself had already answered every question that meeting had raised. Patricia finally broke the comfortable silence. "I used to think protecting the community meant writing stronger rules," she admitted quietly. "Now I think it starts by trusting the people who live here." I nodded because there was nothing to add. The evidence wasn't sitting inside another binder or projected onto another meeting room screen. It was right in front of us. Families talking, neighbors helping one another, Children growing up in a place where differences could be discussed without becoming divisions. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the tall oak trees lining the streets of Willow Creek, I thought back to the morning when a single email had made an entire neighborhood question what kind of community it wanted to become. At the time, I believed I was fighting to protect the right to keep our pets. Looking back now, I realized that wasn't the real victory at all. The real victory was proving that the strongest communities aren't built by fear, assumptions, or blanket restrictions. They're built when ordinary neighbors choose to listen before judging, collaborate before dividing, and solve problems together instead of against one another. Justice rarely arrives with raised voices or dramatic celebrations. More often, it appears quietly, in a respectful conversation, a thoughtful compromise, a neighborhood willing to change, and families walking home together beneath an evening sky, knowing they all still belong. And that is why, every time Cooper nudges my hand before another evening walk, I'm reminded that justice isn't loud. It's smart, patient, and inevitable.